Hello and welcome to FINA H101 Art Appreciation, being put on by Indiana University-Purdue, University of Fort Wayne. My name is Dr. Aaron Schwartz, and this is week 12, and our topic for this week is art and emotion. We will be looking at how artists can evoke emotions and feelings in their viewers through visual form. So with that being said, let's move on to our first image. This is a portion of the Last Judgement scene from the Tympanum of Sainte-Foy in France and dates from about 1124 to 1135. A tympanum in church architecture is an area above a doorway at an entrance to a church that is often decorated with religious imagery. At the center of this carving, you see a pretty nasty-looking devil. He's surrounded by sinners who are being tortured in hell. On the left, there's a knight who has fallen off his horse and head first and is being impaled with a spear by a demon. Next to him, you see a man and a woman who are probably illicit lovers. Their necks are roped together in preparation for hanging. Then on the right-hand side, you see a miser who's being hung. You see a bulge on his front that maybe looks like a potbelly. This is actually a sack of coins tied around his neck. So here his vice is actually weighing him down, contributing to his hanging. On the bottom right is a seated man whose tongue is being yanked out. Presumably he said something he shouldn't have. There are swirling serpents, flames, and overall as many gruesome-looking details as possible. Now, as we look at this scene, I want you guys to think about the context of the scene. This is placed in front of a front door of a church. Why do you think we want to put something as gruesome as this in that kind of a location? Think about what emotion does it evoke or bring up? Why might this emotion be stronger as a person is entering into a church? Might a sinner react differently than somebody who had done no wrong? Would you want to worship in a building with this in front of the door? And why do you think churches today very often tend to avoid sort of images like this? Scenes of torment and judgment and hell were very, very common in the Middle Ages, in churches, in sacred spaces. That's not seen quite as frequently in Christian churches now, in more modern buildings. So consider in your notes what sort of emotions this brings up, why the church at the time thought it was appropriate to put these sorts of images up, and why maybe the church nowadays does not think it's appropriate. So the next piece we're going to look at also served a religious Christian function. You see the limp body of a dead Christ being lowered from the cross. His arms are spread out in a position in which he was crucified to remind the viewer that he had just been nailed up. Surrounding him are mourners, including his mother, the Virgin Mary. She is collapsing or fainting in horror and sadness. We recognize her by her blue dress. And this is an example of color symbolism, or this is when we express information through colors, a form of visual language in which specific colors stand for specific information. There are two levels of emotion we can discuss in a work like this one. First, the emotions of the figures in the scene. Look at the faces here. Look at the body language. What are their emotions? Secondly, looking at their emotions and considering the scene overall, a viewer will react with his or her own emotions. Sometimes the viewer instinctively shares the emotions of the figures in the scene. Sometimes a viewer might react against them. What kind of emotion do you think the artist of this work wanted to invoke in his viewers? And how did he try to achieve those kinds of goals? Finally, whether this image had any religious meaning to you or not, just looking at what's going on here and looking at the emotions of the figures, how does it make you feel? In awe, sad, relieved, confused, annoyed? Do you just feel nothing at all? And that's quite possible. Everyone has different emotional triggers. Also consider that we don't just respond to subject matter. You might be emotionally motivated by colors or forms or light. So take a moment with this, and this can be kind of difficult if you're not used to thinking about art in this way and thinking about your own feelings this way. But do take a moment, not just with this image, but for the rest of this lecture, to really think about what you think the artist is trying to do. How is he trying to get emotions, and what kind of emotions is he trying to get out of you? What is your first gut reaction to the scene when you see it? What is your first immediate emotional response? So take a note of that, and then we'll move on to the next. Now we'll look at two different paintings from two different artists depicting the same scene. It's a gruesome scene from Greek mythology called the Flaying of Marseillaise. Marseillaise was a satyr. In ancient Greek and Roman mythology, this is a half-man, half-goat creature that romped around in the mountains and was especially indulgent of things like wine, women, and music. They were also sometimes pranksters and troublemakers, as was the case with Marseillaise. Marseillaise loved to play music, and he challenged the god Apollo, the god of music, to a contest of who could play better. Now you gotta think, Marseillaise was probably drunk and not thinking clearly when he decided to do this, because anyone in their right mind would know not to challenge a god at his own game. Apollo agreed to compete, and he gathered the judges around, and all but one judge voted for Apollo. Marseillaise thus lost the competition and was condemned to the punishment of being flayed to death. That is, to be flayed, his skin was removed while he was still alive until he succumbed to a very gruesome and painful death. In the painting done by Titian on the left, shows Marseillaise tied upside down by a tree. You see his goat legs tied up with red ribbons as the executioners begin to remove his skin. The man playing violin on the left in the background is probably Apollo, playing on to tantalize Marseillaise and how great a musician he is. Reni's painting is much more focused on the nude Marseillaise receiving his first cut under his arm. Titian uses a lot of very rough brushstrokes in this very busy scene, while Reni shows much more brightly lit, clearly defined figures. Again, we're going to discuss different layers of emotion. So, again, I want you to look at both of these images. First, describe the emotions of the figures in the paintings, and then describe how their emotions differ between the two works. Second, from the perspective of the viewer, how do you react to these paintings? Is one more emotionally powerful to you? Does anything about the style of the painting affect your response? The title of this painting is Roger Freeing Angelica. It's based on a poem from the 1500s, which was itself inspired by ancient Greek Roman mythology. Angelica is a beautiful maiden who's been captured by a dragon. He looks like a sea monster here. Roger is a brave knight who comes on his horse to rescue Angelica. Now I want you to look at this and ask yourself, what is the emotion of each of these figures? What is the emotion of the dragon, of Angelica, of Roger? Then on your second level of emotional consideration, how do you as a viewer feel looking at the scene? What techniques does the artist use to express the emotion of the figures and to draw out emotions in the viewer? Again, think about light, color, drama, body, landscape, environment, all of it. Also, would you consider this a romantic image? Why or why not? Would it be romantic if it only depicted Roger and the dragon? So think about those elements as well. This painting also depicts the story of Roger and Angelica. It was painted 90 years later and is in a very different style. At first you might not be able to see any figures here, but give yourself a moment to adjust to it. I'll describe where to look. See if you can see anything. In the bottom left, the dragon is rising his head out of the waves. Above him, coming through the clouds in sea foam, is Roger on his horse. And on the right, nude, with her hands flung up into the sky, is a small figure of Angelica. While you can't see the emotional expressions of these figures in their faces or their bodies in detail, do you perceive the same emotions as you did in the previous paintings? Why or why not? Do you have any different emotional responses to this painting? What about the brushstrokes, the color, the light, and so on, might be influencing you? Finally, do you find this image romantic? And would you consider more or less romantic than the painting of the same story by Ingres, who was the artist we just looked at in the previous image? Before I tell you the title of this painting or anything about it, I'd like you to first jot down in your notes your immediate emotional responses to it. How does it make you feel? What does it make you think of? And what is it that is influencing your reaction, such as brushstroke, light, color, form, all of that? Your initial reaction might have been confused, awed, fearful, fascinated. The title of this painting is The Burning of the Houses of the Lords and Commons by JMW Turner from 1835. It's a representation of a very large and violent fire that destroyed the British Royal Palace in London in the year 1834. That was just a year before the artist who witnessed the scene himself made this painting. In front of the picture plane, you may see people gathered looking across the river. There are also people in boats watching the scene. These are not refugees, but people who gathered to watch the spectacle. Although this was a great national tragedy, some people with anti-government sentiment considered this to be an event to celebrate, not to mourn. Knowing this about the painting, does your emotional response to it change? Or do you not need the history in order to react and appreciate this on an emotional level? This painting has very clear and simple forms. It's entitled Melancholy, referring to dejection, depression, and low spirits. How do the colors, the forms, the light, the scene, or narrative express this idea of melancholy? Does the man at the front represent melancholy? How do you feel looking at this? Does it affect your moods or your thoughts? And why would an artist want to express sad emotions and possibly evoke them in his viewers? This is not religious. This is not about national tragedy. This is just about sadness. So after the melancholy, hopefully this painting cheers you up. It was painted by the well-known artist Henri Matisse just about 10 years after Munch's Melancholy in 1905. It's entitled Le Bonheur de Vivre, which is French for the joy of life. What characteristics and elements contribute to joyfulness in Matisse's painting here? Do his figures seem joyful? Do you find yourself feeling joyful in response to the image? Also, we've been looking at some pretty serious images of tragedy and sadness that might bring out compassion, fear, sadness, religious dedication, patriotism. In comparison, do you think it is trivial to make a painting just about being happy? Do you think it's a symptom of the modern era to make a painting that's just about happiness? So there's a lot I'm asking you to consider with this one, and take your time to jot down a few of your ideas about it. So let's consider this piece. This piece was made during a style of art known as abstract expressionism. It was a major avant-garde movement in America emerging in the 1940s, in which artists sought to express their state of mind. This painting, Convergence by Jackson Pollock, was done in 1952, and it's very expressive, with its line, color, and energy. It's an example of what we call action painting. That's an abstract expressionist work that visually emphasizes energetic techniques, such as dripping, flinging, or smearing, or different techniques for applying paint to the surface. I'd like you to describe your own emotional response to this painting. Then let's think about another layer of emotion. There are not figures represented here who are expressing emotion, but this painting is directly resulting from the artist, Jackson Pollock's, own state of mind and physical actions of expressing that through the application of paint. Based on that, and how these paintings were created, these are very, very large canvases, and very often Jackson Pollock had to stand and walk across the canvas, which was laid out on the floor, and he would drip and splatter and pour the paint onto the canvas. So you can almost think of it like a dance almost. How would you interpret Pollock's state of mind based on the application of the paint? When you think about this painting as reflecting the emotions of the man who did it, do you react differently? Does this alter your emotions when you just respond to abstract lines and colors? This piece is called Green and Maroon and was created by Mark Rothko in 1953. This is an example of color field painting. That is a type of non-objective painting related to abstract expressionism, but characterized by large flat areas of solid color, emphasizing consistency over gesture and action. It's more about form and less about movement. How does color field painting invoke emotions in a viewer in a different manner than action painting, such as the work by Pollock we just looked at? And without figures, without even any action here, what is there to react to? So jot down some of your ideas here with this. For our last slide, we have a quote from the artist Rothko himself. Now, I want you to take a moment to read this, pause the video if you need to, and then proceed to listen to my comments. Yeah, I'll pause for a little bit. If you need more time, pause the video, and then I'll have a few more things to say. Now, hopefully you've had time to read this entire quote. If not, go ahead and pause and finish reading it. Now that you've read the quote, Rothko's philosophy as an artist, I want you to consider how it actually relates to his work. Are you surprised by the color field painting he created, or did he seem to relate to the philosophy that you're reading here? In the last line, he refers to primitive and archaic art. Archaic art refers to very ancient works, and primitive refers to art of what the modern world saw as undeveloped cultures. So during the 20th century, cultural outsiders from the Western world saw the traditional forms of tribal cultures as representing something purer and closer to nature than modern societies were capable of. Primitivism was a Western modern art movement, rose up as a result of these ideas. Primitivism incorporated imagery and style from non-Western and prehistoric cultures and generally relied on color and simple forms. It developed as a reaction to the anxieties about the advancement of technology and the modern world as it was becoming more and more distant from natural lifestyle. Having known this, or knowing this now, and looking at this quote, do you see the influence of primitivism or actual primitive art in Rothko's color field painting? That will conclude our lecture for week 12. I have on the screen a little bit more information about abstract expressionism, its relationship to neo-expressionism that might be useful to you. So that will conclude what we're talking about for week 12. Make sure that you're keeping up with your readings, your writing assignments, and all of that stuff, the quizzes and everything. As always, if you have any concerns or problems with the Blackboard website, you can find my email address and send me an email right away. Next week, week 13, we'll be talking about music, poetry, and ideas, art as an instrument, and so we'll be getting into some different theories and concepts about art then. Until next time, thank you guys very much for your participation and attention. I appreciate it, and I will talk at you next week. Bye.